The Tower of London is one of the most popular tourist attractions in England. Each year it receives over 2.5 million visitors. They come to see the dazzling crown jewels and the splendid Royal Yeoman warders. They also come to walk through the cold stone halls and cells and see the spot where many famous people lost their heads.
You do get this shiver up the spine as you're walking around, especially on a damp, foggy, misty night around the tower. It can be really off-putting, it really can.
The wind is blowing along the Thames, rattling the chains over the drawbridges, and you can't help forgetting all the grim history of the tower.
In October 1066, Norman forces swarmed across the Channel to invade England. Crushing the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings, the victorious Norman hordes proclaimed their leader, William the Conqueror, King of England.
William came north to his newfound capital of London and realised that unless he took a lot of precautions, he would have the public against him, because no one likes being invaded. And so he decided to build himself a castle.
William chose a hill beside the Thames as the site for one of the 3 castles he built in London. He was not the first conqueror to recognise the tactical advantage of this location.
There actually are remains of an earlier fortress, and fragmentary Roman remains are there today.
It was because of the Roman defences themselves that William the Conqueror chose to build his castle here rather than somewhere else in London, because he found that he had 2 sides of a castle already built, and so he built the White Tower in that angle.
Designed by a monk called Gundulf, this first tower measured 97 by 118 feet and was made from Caen limestone, held together with red mortar. Writers of the time recorded it as mortar tempered with the blood of beasts, but in truth, the colour came from old Roman tiles crushed up in the cement. Gundulf was also responsible for the original design of another castle in the market town of Rochester, even though most of the structure was built after his death. This magnificent ruin provides valuable information about the construction of a 12th century Norman castle.
The Tower of London was not only meant to defend London, it was also meant to dominate it. William the Conqueror wanted something that was, at least in part, a statement of royal power to say to the people of London, I'm the king, I'm here, I'm in charge of you.
As impressive as it appears from the outside, the interior of William's castle was probably far from luxurious.
By our present standards, it was quite harsh, but of course they had different standards in those days. And the royal family lived on the top floor, with an open fire burning. There was very little privacy because they didn't believe in that sort of thing in those days. And the next floor down was the royal courts. The 3rd floor down was the men-at-arms and the personal staff.
Even before it was completed, the tower had received its first prisoner. Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, in his capacity as tax collector, had amassed a bit too much personal wealth, and found himself housed in the tower.
No part of the tower was ever built specifically as a prison, but the Tower of London, like all castles in England, has always been used as a prison at one form or another.
A tower that was strong enough to keep the king's enemies out was equally strong enough to keep the king's enemies in, so they couldn't get out. Dual purpose.
The tower proved to be a better royal home than prison. Less than 6 months after his arrest, Flambard used his wealth and influence to escape.
In those days, depending on your means, you could have your servants, you could have special food brought in, and he had lots of wine brought in, and his friends brought in more barrels of wine, one of which contained ropes. And he invited all the guards to join him in his debauchery he got them all pleasantly drunk, he unwound the rope, dropped it from one of the windows, and escaped.
Succeeding monarchs continuously built onto the tower. The most notable additions came during the reign of King Henry III, who became known as Henry the Builder.
Henry was responsible for a really quite substantial enlargement of the tower's defences. He built most of what we know today as the Inner Curtain Wall.
Intended to protect the king from the growing aspirations of his barons, the changes nearly doubled the area of the tower. Within the new walls, Henry built additional structures to house his garrison, armoury, jewel house, wardrobe, mint, and even the king's menagerie.
The earliest reference we have to wild animals being brought to the tower dates from 1235, when 3 leopards were presented to Henry III by the Emperor Frederick II. That was followed shortly thereafter by the delivery of a polar bear from the King of Norway, and this was provided with a rope and a collar and allowed to go swimming in the Thames, a rather curious sort of vision.
In 1276, the Lion Tower was opened to house the king's growing collection of animals. Visitors had to pass through this massive barbican when entering the fortress. The roars of wild animals would have been heard by anyone arriving for an audience with the king. Today, there are only a few remnants of the magnificent Lion Tower for anyone who knows where to look.
Behind me to the left, you can see just in the cobbles, there is the line of the Lion Tower going across from the railings right the way to the door into the shop there. And behind us to the right, literally beneath us, is the Lion Tower itself. That's the wall of the tower. Now you can see from just how much there is down here going down beneath our feet. It was a massive building. What you have to imagine is there's much again standing above ground. So it was a huge building in its own right.
Henry's son, Edward I, completed the expansion of the tower by building the outer curtain wall. Although ensuing years brought many changes to structures within the walls, the outer limits of the Tower of London were now set. It had 20 towers in all, covering an area of over 12 acres. It became a city within the City of London.
The tower would have been a very, very busy place. It wouldn't just be the king and the queen, it would be hundreds of people with them. There would have been people cooking all over the place, so plenty of smoke and heat. It would have been a bustling place throughout its life.
By the 15th century, what was once a modest fortification had been transformed into a lavish and secure royal palace. By the mid-15th century, the Lancaster family had been ruling England for 62 years. Their hold on power was beginning to falter as a mysterious and debilitating disease affected King Henry VI.
He lost his wits and memory for a time, and nearly all his body was so uncoordinated and out of control that he could neither walk nor hold his head up. John Wethamstead, Abbot.
Using this weakness, the rival House of York attacked the king and lay claim to the throne. The ensuing clash between these two powerful houses became known as the Wars of the Roses, because the Lancastrian coat of arms features a red rose and the York's a white one.
During the Wars of the Roses, the tower became more of a state prison. The great families were warring with each other, and the tower actually became not only a place of imprisonment, but also the scene of regicide and fratricide.
In 1461, the Yorkist King Edward IV usurped the throne and made King Henry a prisoner of the Tower. Mad Henry, as he became known, was held in the Wakefield Tower until 1471, when he was mysteriously found dead in front of his altar.
The official line on the death of Henry VI was that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy at being deposed, but examination of his skull in 1910 showed it had been cloven with some hard instrument, possibly a knife or an axe. It's virtually certain that Henry VI was murdered to get him out of the way.
Edward began a brutal campaign to silence his enemies. No one was safe, not even his own family. In 1478, Edward locked his brother George in the Devereux Tower, sentencing him to death for treason. The execution was carried out in a most unusual manner.
He obviously had a bit of a reputation as a drinker, so it looks very much as if, yes, he was drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine. What a way to go.
Less colourful ends awaited many prominent Lancastrians on the scaffold built on top of Tower Hill. Others found themselves locked away indefinitely in the tower. Conditions varied greatly depending on the wealth and status of the prisoner.
In those days, if you were noble, you would still be kept in conditions according to your status. Good furniture, good food and so forth. So they wouldn't necessarily have noticed any difference from their everyday lives, except that they were very clearly prisoners.
For prisoners unable to afford such luxury, a stay in the tower was a very different experience. While incarcerated for treason in 1553, Bishop John Fisher wrote,
I have neither shirt nor suit, nor yet other clothes. Notwithstanding, I might easily suffer that, if they would keep my body warm. But my diet also, God knoweth how slender it is at any times.
Many prisoners used belt buckles, nails and knives to carve intricate inscriptions in the tower walls. Some can still be seen today. They are a very personal reminder of the prisoners of a turbulent and uncertain age.
I think the worst thing about being in the tower, even if you were rich and you were comfortable and you were well provided for, I think the worst thing was the uncertainty of never knowing when the constable was going to come to your door and say either that you were going to be executed on the morrow, 9 o'clock, or you were free to go. And you just didn't know. It depended on the whim of the king.
In addition to execution, unrepentant prisoners faced torture. Although the use of torture has always been illegal in England, it was condoned within the tower walls.
Now, people were never tortured unless the authorities were convinced that they were guilty. They were then tortured for two reasons: to make them admit their crime, and secondly, and even more important, to make them admit the names of their fellow conspirators. So torture was not a punishment, it was simply a persuasive method.
These persuasive methods involved devices like thumbscrews, pillywinks, cashie-laws, and bilboes. But the most feared device was introduced to the tower by John Holland, Duke of Exeter. Although often referred to as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, victims shuddered at its more descriptive name, the rack.
Their limbs were tied to opposite ends of this terrible machine, and the winches were turned, and it literally dislocated all the joints. In fact, it described one person as coming out a foot taller than he had been born, or born to be. And it was a pretty awful instrument.
Long before it got to that stage, whether you had committed the crime or not, you admitted that you had done.
The Tower of London quickly gained a grisly reputation. This infamy grew with the events following the death of King Edward IV in 1483, which made his 13-year-old son Edward successor. The boy's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, was assigned to be his protector, but instead he proclaimed himself King Richard III. The Duke had all of the boy's advisers arrested, including Lord William Hastings. Hastings was dragged from a meeting of the Privy Council and beheaded on the Tower Green.
A peer of the realm was entitled to be tried by his peers by law, but this was an act without any recourse to law, an act of pure tyranny, and it set off what we now think of as a reign of terror.
Richard realised that his claim would never be secure as long as the true successor, Prince Edward, was alive. Richard III had Edward and his brother placed in a secure section of the tower where their every move was controlled. The boy's doctor reported,
All the attendants who had waited upon the king would be barred access to him. He and his brother were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the tower proper, till at last they ceased to appear. Dr. Argentine.
In the streets of London, rumours began to circulate that the boys had been murdered.
Only one person could be responsible for the prince's deaths, and that was Richard III. Thomas More gives a very detailed account of the murder. He says that the princes were murdered by arrangement of Sir James Tyrrell on Richard's orders, and that two men were actually instructed to do the murder, to suffocate them with pillows, whilst Tyrrell waited outside the door, and that they were buried neatly deep under the stair-foot under a great pile of rubble. And that is exactly where, in 1674, a chest was found containing human bones.
After only 2 years as king, Richard was killed in battle. The crowning of his successor, Henry Tudor, marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of the bloodiest period in Tower history. Henry Tudor became King Henry VIII in 1509. In keeping with tradition, he spent the night before his coronation in the Tower of London, which was now over 400 years old.
During Tudor times, the royal apartments were falling into disrepair, new modes of building, new ideas of comfort were coming in, and it became rather old-fashioned. It was regarded as that. And they were used only to fulfil the tradition that a monarch spent a night or so before the coronation in the Tower.
While Henry rarely stayed in the Tower, he did make full use of it as a prison. Without a son to inherit the throne, Henry ruthlessly sent anyone who might have a minor claim to the throne to the Tower, or the gallows on Tower Hill.
Public executions took place on Tower Hill, just outside the boundaries of the Tower, and they were a very popular form of entertainment for centuries.
Let's take the kids to the execution, the Londoners would say. And they'd get up early to get a good seat on the stand which had specially been erected.
These burgeoning crowds sometimes took an active part in the proceedings.
The common people would surge forward after the execution with handkerchiefs and scraps of cloth and try to dip them in the victim's blood so that they would have souvenirs which were considered efficacious against certain ailments, and that's something that they would keep as a memento. People weren't very squeamish at all in those days.
The manner of death depended more on the social position of the condemned than on the nature of their crime. The poor were hanged, while the rich faced the more genteel fate of beheading.
The aristocrats were entitled to being executed by cold steel. This was the nearest thing to being killed in action in battle by an enemy sword, whereas your ordinary prisoners just had the hempen rope. We were very class-conscious in those days, no doubt about it.
Though reserved for aristocrats, beheading was far from a civilized death. Several strokes were often required to sever the condemned's head.
The axe was an appallingly inaccurate weapon, but remember that it wasn't a merciful era. You were there to be punished. So why should you have a quick and clean end if you tried to overthrow the throne? Literally, you got all that was coming to you. You really got it in the neck.
The most horrific sentence that a prisoner could receive was reserved for those convicted of treason, called the 4 horrors of the traitor's death.
and that meant that you were drawn on a hurdle from where you'd been imprisoned to the place of execution, and then you were hanged until you were half dead, cut down, revived with vinegar.
Your stomach was slit open with the ripping knife. You were castrated as a symbolic way of ensuring that you could never have children who could have such treacherous thoughts as you had. Your bowels and entrails were pulled out and thrown on the fire which was burning by the scaffold. Then you were beheaded, your head placed on London Bridge, and your body cut into quarters, and they were sent to the various cities where you had lived and probably plotted against the sovereign, and they were displayed on the city gates as deterrent.
Henry became obsessed with fathering a male heir. He turned against his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had borne him only a daughter, deciding to divorce her in favour of a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. When the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, the enraged king declared himself head of the Church of England and made divorce legal, thus sparking the English Reformation. The Reformation created an entirely new category of enemies for Henry VIII, who sent droves of Catholic opponents to the Tower prisons. One of the most notable was Henry's friend and advisor, Sir Thomas More.
Sir Thomas More was one of the finest minds of the age, a great humanist, a man of learning. He was a very devout Catholic, and a man of great principle and integrity who had an international reputation for this.
More's devotion to his faith prevented him from supporting the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. In 1533, the king put him in the Tower under sentence of death for treason.
Sir Thomas More was executed on Tower Hill, and there's a lovely story of the executioner was helping him up. He said, "Thank you for helping me up the steps. As for my going down, I'll see to myself."
The woman who indirectly caused More's death soon followed him to the grave. In January 1536, after only 3 years of marriage, Anne Boleyn had produced only one surviving child, a girl, the Princess Elizabeth. Henry had his second wife arrested on the false charges of adultery with her brother and taken to the Tower. As Queen, Boleyn was comfortably housed in the same apartments she occupied on the night before her coronation, and Henry granted her a last special favour.
Anne Boleyn was executed in an unusual manner. She was not executed by an axe. In fact, the king sent to Saint-Omer in France for an experienced swordsman to strike off her head because it would be a quicker, cleaner death. And this is thought to have been in return for her cooperation in agreeing to the annulment of her marriage and the bastardy of her daughter.
On the day of her execution, Anne climbed the scaffold specially built on Tower Green. It was raised higher than usual to allow the audience a good view. The French executioner did not use a block, so Anne knelt before him, checking that her skirts demurely covered her feet and ankles. The executioner quietly picked up his sword, which had been hidden under a pile of straw. Even though he held the blade in his hands, he called out, "Bring me the sword." Anne instinctively turned towards his voice.
And her head was sliced off literally in an instant, we are told. The head was lifted up in the usual manner, and the executioner cried, "Behold the head of a traitor." And at that moment the eyes and lips were seen to move, and the onlookers were absolutely shocked.
And so when Anne Boleyn's head was severed, did she see the ground coming up to meet her? Did she look down at the faces of the people gathered round the scaffold before blackness overcame her? Who knows? I'm unable to find a volunteer to prove or disprove that, regrettably.
6 years later, King Henry's fifth wife met a similar fate. The charges of infidelity levelled against her were at least partially true, and so Catherine Howard did not receive the same courtesies as Anne Boleyn. she must suffer the English axeman.
The night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her apartments so that she could practice how to lay her head on it and make a good death, so she wouldn't let down the noble house of Howard, of which she was a member.
The last noble victim condemned under Henry VIII was the Duke of Norfolk, but the night before his scheduled execution, the Duke was awakened in his cell by the ringing of all the bells in London. The king had died in his sleep, thus bringing Norfolk an unexpected reprieve and an end to Henry Tudor's 38-year reign. On September the 2nd, 1666, fire broke out in the wooden tenements along Pudding Lane. The wind whipped the blaze out of control as it headed for the Tower of London and its contents.
It was used as the main gunpowder store for the tower, and you can imagine what would have happened with just a simple spark in the wrong place. Bang goes the White Tower in every single sense.
As the flames crept ever closer, a radical plan was agreed. They used the gunpowder to blow up the buildings surrounding the tower walls. The demolished buildings created a fire break, and the tower was spared. But the rest of London was not so lucky. In a 4-day inferno, nearly 4/5 of the buildings within the walled city were destroyed. Led by Christopher Wren, the plans to rebuild were an enormous undertaking, but they transformed London into one of the great modern cities of the time. The new London ushered in an era of more refined tastes. The Tower was still bursting with political prisoners, but torture had fallen out of favour. The rack was employed for the last time in 1640. The more humane atmosphere in the Tower led to an increase in escapes.
I researched and found about 40 who escaped. Thousands didn't. No security is 100% certain, so we always had a few daring ones who evolved different methods of escaping.
Perhaps the most romantic story of escape belongs to Scotsman William Maxwell, Earl of Nithsdale. In 1716, Lord Nithsdale was implicated in a plot to depose King George I and reclaim the crown for his Scottish House of Stuart.
He was captured and brought to the Tower with several other lords, Scottish lords. They were all condemned to death. And they had more or less resigned themselves, as one does in the Tower of London, to meet such an end.
On hearing of her husband's arrest, Lady Nithsdale travelled on horseback from Scotland through a winter storm to plead for mercy from the king. When her petitions failed, she masterminded the escape of her husband.
Of course, in those days they were allowed to visit the condemned husbands, and she brought down with her two of her friends with extra coats over their own coats, and they worked out a strategy whereby they moved in and out, covering their faces with handkerchiefs, weeping bitterly at the coming execution of their master and husband.
The women appeared so agitated that the guards began to take no notice as they constantly moved in and out of the cell. The jailers lost track of their comings and goings, precisely the effect Lady Nithsdale had hoped for, creating an opportunity for her lord to escape.
She worked out a plan that she would make him up to appear like a woman with heavy makeup on and a wig, and in the melee that they so cleverly and cunningly constructed, Lord Nithsdale, sobbing bitterly, walked out past the yeoman warders.
Lady Nithsdale remained in the cell and held a long conversation with herself in two voices. As she left, she locked the door and instructed the servants not to disturb her husband at prayer. By the time the deception was discovered, Lord and Lady Nithsdale had escaped to Rome.
And apparently the king said, well, with a wife like that, he deserved to escape the axe. Rather nice, I thought.
On April 9th, 1747, one of Nithsdale's fellow conspirators, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, earned a less enviable place in Tower history when he became the last man to be beheaded in Britain. The makeshift stands on Tower Hill were crammed with so many spectators that one collapsed, killing 20 people. Watching the mayhem from the gallows, Lovat quipped, "The more mischief, the better sport."
As the 18th century wore on, the Tower played host to fewer and fewer prisoners. And indeed, one of the last most notable prisoners of the late 18th century was an American, Henry Lawrence.
Lawrence, the president of the Continental Congress, was captured off the coast of Holland when his ship was overrun by a British man of war. When a search of Lawrence's belongings turned up a treaty pledging Dutch support for the American Revolution against England, he was branded a rebel and led to the Tower in chains.
He seems to have had a rather miserable time. The governor of the time, a man called Gore, took a dislike to him. Gore seems to have contrived to make him take his daily walk at moments of the day when the public could go off at him. Lawrence records one incident where he was sort of shoved out through the front door with a sword in his back to make sure he went out there and could be seen by the public.
After 15 months of confinement in the Tower, Lawrence finally won his release in exchange for Lord Charles Cornwallis, a British general being held by American troops. Lawrence held the distinction of being the last American prisoner of war ever held in the Tower. In 1837, Victoria became Queen. This marked the beginning of a new era for England and the Tower of London. State offices which once dominated the Tower were now gone. Even the menagerie, which had been part of Tower history for 600 years, was finally closed in 1835. Most of the animals were moved to the new Regent's Park Zoo, and the Lion Tower was raised to open up the western entrance.
That was really rather unfortunate, because what must have been one of the most magnificent and certainly most formidable parts of the Tower disappeared at the stroke, almost at the whim of the Victorians, who wanted to clear away the area and make it a more historic, in inverted commas, environment for visitors.
For the first time in its history, the Tower became a major tourist attraction. The number of visitors climbed from 11,000 in 1837 to more than 95,000 in only 4 years.
The Tower of London has always been a place of interest for visitors, and even in the medieval period we have references to foreign dignitaries coming to the Tower to look at the armoury and other attractions. So the Tower of London as a tourist attraction goes back many hundreds of years.
The Tower settled gracefully into its new role, but its days of official duty were not completely behind it. On the 28th of June, 1914, the assassination of Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand plunged Europe into war. Great Britain allied with France and Russia to fight the Germans. For a brief time, the Tower reverted to its former role as a prison, housing 11 German spies.
They were condemned to death, and then they were brought back to the Tower of London, and in the little firing squad, which used to stand only yards from my apartment in the tower, there they faced the firing squad and were shot.
During the First World War, the tower staff attempted to maintain a normal routine, but it became increasingly difficult with the advent of a new weapon of war, the aeroplane.
The Kaiser had actually instructed his political advisors not to bomb the royal palaces and historic buildings of London, but as the war dragged on and air raids became more frequent, the tower came under greater threat.
On June the 13th, 1917, an unexploded bomb fell into the moat area, but none of the tower buildings were damaged, unlike 30 years later, when Britain was once more thrust into war. During the Second World War, the Tower of London served numerous functions. Its basements provided protection as air raid shelters. The filled-in moat became a garden, and some of its buildings once again housed prisoners of war. Rudolf Hess was detained in the tower for 4 days, and German spy Joseph Jacobs was executed on August the 15th, 1940. He was the last person ever executed in the tower. As the war intensified, London was pummeled by a barrage of heavy aerial assaults from German planes and rockets. Nothing was safe, even the tower.
From 1940, it was subjected to heavy bombing raids, and many historic buildings were blown apart or damaged.
We moved everybody out as the bombs were starting to drop, and luckily for everybody concerned, after everybody was cleared out the old hospital block, it took a direct hit. There was nobody injured by it.
Although damage to the tower was extensive, there was an unexpected positive aspect to the bombing. Previously unknown archaeological artifacts were discovered within the ruins of Victorian buildings.
It was only really when that was being demolished that it was realised that some of the original curtain walls of Henry VIII's reign actually survived intact, literally encapsulated within the Victorian structure.
History built upon history, a reminder of how far back the origins of this monument go. Ongoing archaeological digs continue to discover surprises that add detail to the growing history of the Tower of London.
Well, the tower is a tremendously complex place. It's been developing really ever since William the Conqueror built it in 1066, or started it off. And it's almost like a layer cake, and that's why it's such an endlessly fascinating place archaeologically, because there is all that evidence for the past laid out beneath your feet, quite literally in many cases.
It is this wealth of history that draws more than 2 million visitors to the tower each year.
I look at the Tower of London as a living history book. If you control the Tower of London, you control the country, hence its size and its majesty.
When I walk the grounds of the tower today and I go into the towers and look at the chambers that still survive, I'm overwhelmed with a sense of history. I'm absolutely fascinated by this place and always have been, and I find that it's the sense of history that is so compelling.
Tomorrow at the same time, in History Uncovered, it's the great train robbery of the 60s, a crime for which some, of course, escape punishment. But stay tuned, as coming up next, there's news about how you can take part in the History Channel's local history project, Photos for the Future.